Thanks also for inviting me to this marvelous occasion. I wouldn't be so nervous, but this room intimidates me. So I begin by saying that they probably found the whistling coon down by the Hudson busking among ferrygoers. For a small fee, George W. Johnson could whistle the popular tunes of the 1890s with alacrity and an unnerving accuracy. At that time, New York was the seat of the entertainment industries, and gramophone peddlers were scrambling for those curious cylindrical inscriptions that lured patrons to their coin-operated phonographs. Although a black man, Johnson's vocalic abilities were novel, and minstrelsy was increasingly welcome as white Americans confronted their racial anxieties in popular entertainment. The phonographers paid Johnson 20 cents for every 2-minute recording he made, which was a lucrative enterprise when you consider that at that time, every recording they made was a master. Only 3 or 4 cylinders could be inscribed at once, the horns of the recording machines arranged around Johnson's resonant mouth. Within 10 years, technological innovation would enable the simultaneous inscription of multiple slave copies, even copies of copies, such that gradually the master's voice, the master's recorded voice, became autonomous, needing that seat of inspiration, the diaphragm, just the once. By 1905, Johnson's recording career was over. The march of inscriptive technology that eventually hijacked Johnson's voice maps in an unintended way Henri Bergson's formula for laughter, something mechanical encrusted upon the living. With nods to the original French phrasing of Bergson's formula, which I will not pronounce unless you need a good laugh, we can also render laughter as something lawful encrusted upon the living. My remarks today will orbit a number of ways in which we can imagine the mechanical or lawful coming to bear upon that noumenal domain of human spirit that Bergson dubbed the life impulse. Now, at first blush, the mechanical encrusted upon the living betokens that all too familiar dialectical tension between what Marx dubbed the relations of production and the forces of production. That our livelihoods always seem beholden yet resistant to technological incrustations, iPhone, is a hopelessly familiar regularity. But there are the mechanics of respiration too, some autonomic, some purposefully labored, and the law that is figured between them as signification. I've really begun with Johnson's example first because his best-selling record was not fixated on his unusual talent for whistling, but rather on his ability to laugh in tune. Laughing Song purportedly sold over 25,000 copies by 1894 and was among the most popular phonographic cylinders of the late 19th century. After Johnson's wildly successful single, so-called laughing records would continue to sell briskly for almost 30 years. Arguably, it was the first genre of recorded music. According to Jacob Smith, the main purpose of these records seems to have been the incitation of the listener's infectious laughter, a kind of sonic contagion that Bergson's timely theory of the comic helped to explain. At the crown of the golden age of phonography, Bergson suggested that the infection of laughter was a kind of unknowing physiological encounter with Kant's famous antinomy of free will, quote, "We laugh every time a person gives us the impression of a thing." Freud would later elaborate a similar tension between humans and robots to explain the fear of the uncanny, which I suppose is why so many of us find Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney as funny as he is frightening. I mentioned Freud on the uncanny and Bergson on laughter together to underscore their common concern with repetition. Freud argued that an experience of the uncanny depended on, quote, the constant recurrence of the same thing. And as Alenka Zupančič helpfully describes it, for Bergson, what ties infectious laughter with the uncanny is a simultaneous experience of the automatic and the spontaneous, the machinic and the elastic, or more simply, the alive and the dead. Because Johnson's laughing song is a recording and the historical precursor to what we know today as the laugh track, Igambulik's example may help us to think about the issue of memory. My argument is that canned laughter is the condensation symbol for public memory in our time. Now, I state my argument with some hesitation because I confess I have not worked it all out. My talk today is carved from a much longer book-length project I'm tentatively titling Haunting Voices, Morning Speech in Postmodernity. In this monograph, I examine the way in which the object of speech, as an autonomous thing most readily apprehended in voice recordings, is deployed and circulated in various processes of cultural mourning. Now, in general, I'm fascinated by the cultural rules for the permissibility of public spasm, or what I'm terming uncontrolled speech, and the way vocalic ruptures unite and divide groups of people. As anyone who has lost it and been comforted, or worse, scolded, in the company of others knows, crying in pain or sobbing in grief are, in fact, governed forms of speech, however spontaneous. Like its cousins, hiccups and sneezes and slips of the tongue, laughter helps to expose the constructedness and fissures of the subject. With a high five to Avital Ronell, Diane Davis argues that cracking up or losing it exposes our addictions to language, if not our abject dependency on something, quote, that is not human, but that brings the human into being. Indeed, my thinking today is inspired by Davis's brilliant book, Breaking Up at Totality, which advances the first rhetorical theory of losing one's shit. Now, I want to suggest that one way we can read the release Davis recommends is as a terms coming with the compulsion to repeat. What else is laughter but speech given over to compulsion, an almost mindless and mechanical possession that nonetheless gives us a sense of being alive. Rhetoricians are perhaps most familiar with repetition compulsion in the work of Uncle Burke, whose ruminations on form inspired a nascent rhetoric of repetition as a counterpart to the rhetoric of representation. We might propose that a rhetoric of repetition is what many of us are after when we are trying to figure out the body, or the dance of the affirmative turn, or the corpus of public memory. Rhetorically speaking, ground zero for repetition is probably better located in the work of Susan Langer, but for good or ill, we have received it through Burke. Now, in his essay, The Psychology of Audience, Burke defines form as, quote, the creation of an appetite in the mind of an auditor and the adequate satisfaction of that appetite. As Deborah Haughey has pointed out, Burke's thinking on form was influenced by his brief stint as a music critic and the way in which that role influenced him to think about how music acts on a body. In this respect, we can think of Johnson's laughing song as a kind of double whammy of appetite inducement. Nevertheless, Burke's understanding of form depends on bodily excitation, or as I will suggest in the language of Lacan, an experience of jouissance. Both Burke and Lacan's understanding of bodily inducement depend on repetition. However, it would be a mistake to equate their respective views. They differ significantly on two interrelated points: the character of satisfaction and the status of the body. For those of you familiar with Burke and Lacan, I'm suggesting that Burke is stuck on pleasure, while Lacan would think repetition through jouissance, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. Jouissance, which is not pleasure, but something beyond it, a kind of unnerving fascination that, as Bruce Fink puts it, compels us to get off, however clean or dirty. Nevertheless, for the sake of time, let me dwell on only one of these points, and that's the character of satisfaction. For Burke, form hinges on a bodily experience of the anticipated sequencing of textual repetitions. This satisfaction, says Burke, quote, at times involves a temporary set of frustrations, but in the end, these frustrations prove to be simply a more involved kind of satisfaction, intensifying the experience. Such a telic perspective on form appears indebted to some degree to Freud's conception of a pleasure principle, which comes out clearly in Permanence and Change when he elaborates his theory of form. Now, as with his appropriation of many of Freud's ideas, however, we could argue that Burke did not pursue the elaboration of form's compulsions far enough. Although Freud admitted that repetition is a source of pleasure, he also argued that the compulsion to repeat is driven by something beyond pleasure, ultimately a drive to, quote, restore an earlier state of things, a drive toward equilibrium or death. Freud came to this conclusion after repeatedly observing individuals who compulsively returned to painful situations or destructive behaviors despite themselves. For Freud, pleasure and pain seemed to function in ways that bespoke a common structure that were not reducible to mere biology or conditioning. Moreover, he observed that even when a patient was able to narrativize a trauma, sometimes unwanted symptoms persisted. Freud concluded that there must be a limit to interpretation, a limit to representation. He also eventually concluded that there is no total satisfaction of the compulsion to repeat. There is no total satisfaction to repetition compulsion because it is a kind of structural frustration in itself. Repetition compulsion is a sort of continual restatement, or as Lacan says, insistence of a limit on this entropic urge toward stasis. Now, taking Freud's lead, Lacan argued that the compulsion to repeat, quote, is based on the return of jouissance, which would imply that the pleasures of form, insofar as they are recognized as such, are a kind of substitution or limit on total satisfaction. Pleasure is actually a frustration of, or a form of prohibition against, unbridled jouissance. Unlike Burke's notion of form, a Lacanian understanding describes the pleasure of repetition as a substitute satisfaction. Metaphorically speaking, the recognition of form as such applies brakes to the engine of enjoyment, preventing a crash. Now, I realize this is a little abstract, so let me summarize. Thus far, I've noted the similarities of Bergson and Freud on laughter and the uncanny concern a tension between the mechanical and the presumably human. Both concern repetition, with which rhetoricians are most familiar through the work of Burke on form. I caution that Burke stays on the controllable, pleasurable side of repetition and does not push it where Freud would have us go, into its uncanny dimension. Lacan provides us with a useful term for this endlessly fascinating but nevertheless discomforting dimension, jouissance. This is the legacy of Johnson's laughter, the handheld gizmo that enables me to reproduce canned laughter repeatedly and almost indefinitely, that is, until the batteries run out. Whereas Burke would have us focus on the novelty of repetition as the source of frustration and satisfaction, Lacan would underscore the literal repetition of the laughter, even though every time I mash this button, an identical sound seems to come from its little speaker. I cannot mash this button the same way twice, nor can you hear each iteration with the same meaning. It is that difference in the repetition with which we are concerned. That gap that we move back and forth across is the affirmative or positive rupture of jouissance. Now, you might think that my playing with this gizmo is childish, and you might have been annoyed by it, especially if I kept continuing to press it. Zupancic argues that this childish or annoying quality is why comedy is assumed to have no class. Lacan's examples are telling. One is a version that you and I would recognize today as peekaboo. Another is about the child who demands that you read her the same story over and over at bedtime. The association of the excessiveness of human affectivity with childishness and repetition also begins to shed some light on why the rhetorical canon of delivery has been neglected this past century. From a Lacanian vantage, repetition is at the crossroads of what we have resigned to delivery and memory. I say crossroads because repetition compulsion is lodged really in the in-between, neither wholly in delivery nor wholly in its mnemic traces, but in the movement across from one and then back to the other. This is where the sound engineer Charles Douglas comes to haunt us from the past.
What'd you bring me?
The laugh box.
A laugh box? Where'd you get it?
At a storage auction. The people don't pay their bills and they auction the stuff off to pay the storage fees.
So did you get a lot of stuff in the locker?
All their used household goods, their washer and dryer, things like that, furniture.
So what made you think this would be worth bringing to Antiques Roadshow?
It was just an interesting thing, and I was actually going to throw it away because it just didn't look like they had any value, but I just thought, it's interesting, so then I started doing a little more research what it is.
You found out that this was the laugh track machine,
Yes.
the original one.
The original.
This little machine is a group of tape loops.
Okay.
And Charlie Douglas invented this laugh track machine for early television. In 1953, he said, we need a better audio solution for the audience reaction.
Okay.
So he would get really great recordings and then offer those recordings to the television companies to enhance their programming. Why don't you push one of the buttons?
Now, Charlie Douglas was fiendishly secretive about his invention, and few of those who hired him to add laugh tracks to their television shows were allowed to actually see this device. Thank gosh for Antiques Roadshow. Television executives commonly reminisce about the laugh box as a kind of dirty secret. Now, there's a lot to say about the controversy of using canned laughter, but to finish in time, I need to cut the cheese. So, whence the drive to capture laughter? And why was the laugh box considered a dirty secret? There are many answers, some historical, and many concern the practical politics of television production. For example, some argued that the laugh box was necessary when television shifted to the pre-recording era to help maintain an illusion of liveness. Canned laughter was also thought to be an index of an authentically human presence, however machinic. Shortly after Douglas's death in 2003, Slavoj Žižek plagiarized himself, again, with a widely read column that suggested canned laughter was a labor-saving technology, laughing for us after a hard day's work. In agreement with Žižek, Henry Cripps has argued that the intrapassivity of canned laughter participates in the ideological labor of a postmodern cynicism. I want to close by suggesting the dirty secret of canned laughter also speaks to the contrivance of public memory as a form of inhibition and of violence, but also that this is not necessarily bad or avoidable. We know, for example, that the voices heard on Douglas's embalming machine are of dead people, which is sort of creepy when you find yourselves laughing along with them. Still, those dead people can inspire us to crack up. Johnson's belly laugh in the face of an ugly racism can catalyze our enjoyment too. These recordings can set off a kind of compulsion that bleeds beyond the signifier toward that space of the in-between. The idea that one can capture laughter is, at some level, an inhibition against what we call, over in communication studies, speech anxiety. Many of you who teach undergraduates will recognize this anxiety in the millennial generation who would much rather interact with others on Facebook or archive their reactions to world events on YouTube than risk an interpersonal encounter. However illusory an interpersonal encounter, the interpersonal risk, is that the surprise of rupture, of chance, of an otherwise mechanical regularity of exchange. In this sense, canned laughter is particularly demonstrative of what Jacques Derrida termed the structure of the archive, which is, quote, accumulation and capitalization of memory on some substrate and in an exterior place, that is nevertheless driven by a passion or a fever that undoes its own frenzy toward mastery. That canned laughter can nevertheless uncan us, that the comic can bring us to the uncanny, is a productive violence. Now, I realize such a statement is oblique, so let me try to get a bit closer to what I'm driving at. In a brilliant essay on sublimation as the possibility of a radical political will, Barbara Biesecker, I hope you get to meet her one day, Barbara Biesecker clears up a mistaken assumption about the death drive, an assumption that I have unfortunately made in print myself. In the words of Joan Kopchik, quote, there is no single complete drive, only partial drives, and thus no realizable will to destruction because, in the end, quote, the drive inhibits the achievement of its aim. Biesecker responds, and I really love this line, quote, this is good news. This is very good news. I think this is the good news of canned laughter as an exemplar of public memory, for in the repetitions of the inscriptions of memory is the possibility of something else, of a compulsion that exceeds the sediments of settled histories. The democratizing potential of archival technology today, the explosion, for example, of YouTube, the advent of independent nonprofit groups like StoryCorps, the proliferation of audio archives, unquestionably provides us the distance of forgetfulness. Even so, attending more closely to the grain of Johnson's laughter, letting ourselves get carried away with him, teaches us, as Diane Davis writes, to, quote, hear the noise, the excess that gets sacrificed for the clarity of the one.